An easy way to reshape an object is to use the Liquify filter. In this image, I want to reshape the clock a little bit, but not the background. So it's going to be easier if I select the clock and then copy it to its own layer. From the toolbar, I'll select the elliptical marquee tool and then click and drag an elliptical marquee around the clock. I'll go ahead and release the cursor and then choose Select and Transform Selection. Now it's not critical that I select exactly the clock here, but I want to get close, so I'll hold down the Command key in order to change the side of the clock there and distort it a little bit here. I just want to make sure that I definitely have all of the clock, so it's okay if I have a little bit beyond the clock because I can always mask that later. I just want to make sure that I have the entire clock in order to liquify it. So I might actually add a little bit of space there. All right, then I'll tap Return or Enter. And now that I have my selection, I'll use the keyboard shortcut Command J in order to make a duplicate of that selection. I want to convert both of these into Smart Objects. So on the Layers panel, I'll right-click and choose Convert to Smart Object for Layer 1. And I'll do the same thing on the background, right-clicking and then choosing Convert to Smart Object. Now, making sure that Layer 1 is targeted, under the Filter menu, I'll choose Liquify. There are a number of different tools on the left-hand side, including tools we can use to warp our image. We can also reconstruct our image and smooth our image. And below that, we can add distortions such as twirling our images or puckering or bloating or shifting left or right. So let's take a quick preview of what each one of these does. The warp tool will just allow me to click and drag out warps. If I want to reconstruct or undo an area, then I can select the second tool and push it back. It might be helpful to show the mesh for a moment to see what's happening. So when I've warped it, we can see the warp in the mesh. When I reconstruct it, we can see the mesh being put back. All right, let's hide the mesh. The next tool will allow me to smooth an area. So if I warp this area here and then just want to smooth it gently, I can use that tool. Underneath that, we can twirl this. So if I want to twirl the center of the clock, we can do that. And by the way, if the tools are too small or too large, over on the right-hand side is where you control your size as well as pressure and rate and density for creating these distortions. I'll move to the next tool. This is the pucker tool. If I click and just hold my cursor, you can see the center of the clock is getting smaller. If I want it to get larger, I can either switch to the bloat tool or just hold down the Option key. That will automatically toggle those two tools. In fact, if I return back to the twirl clockwise, if I click and drag, by default the tool does go clockwise, but if I hold down the Option key, it will twirl in the other direction. All right, the Shift Left or Shift Right tool, if I click and drag up, you can see that it shifts to the left. If I click and drag down, the content will shift to the right. All right, let's go ahead and restore this or reset it. I'll click Restore All. And while we're looking at the different options, we do have an option to show the backdrop if we wanted to see the layer underneath, but for right now, I'll just toggle that off. All right, I'll select the Warp tool, and I'm just going to make the edges of this clock warp a little bit by just pulling them out. Maybe not quite so even. I am pulling them out away, making the clock larger as opposed to making it smaller. That's just going to make it easier to mask with the underlying layer. And let's go ahead and give just a slight twirl to the clock face. Now, if there's areas that you don't want to disturb, you can always freeze those areas. I'll choose my Freeze tool. And let's say, for example, I didn't want to move any of the numbers. I can go ahead and paint over any of that area, and then they won't move when I use something like the Twirl tool. I'll get a little bit smaller of a brush here and click and drag so that the clock hands start to twirl. But if I were to go over to this area, you can see that even though my brush is over the numbers, it's not moving any of that frozen area. It does look like I missed a little bit at the bottom there, but that's okay. All right, if you wanted to unfreeze an area, you can just select the next tool and paint over it. Okay, when we're happy with our adjustments, we'll click OK. And I can see the outer areas here where I'm going to need to mask them off. But instead of spending a lot of time doing it now, let's go ahead and make a change to layer 0 and then see what we need to mask. So with layer 0 selected, I'm going to choose Filter and then Blur Gallery and then Path Blur. Path Blur allows me to create a blur based on a path. I'm going to create 2 paths, but first I'm going to move the first one right down here by clicking on the pin and dragging it. I'll click on the next pin and drag it over here. And you can see as I extend the path, there's actually a center point. So now when I move that center point, the direction of the blur follows that path. I can change the speed of the blur over in the blur tool areas, and I can also edit the blur shapes. If you don't see this red area here to edit the blur shapes, you need to click or double click on the end of the blur in order to display those. Then I'll click on the center point and just move it a little bit. And you can see that it's adding like a little bit more motion. It's editing the actual blur shape, not the direction or the path of the blur, but the shape of the blur. I'll click on the left-hand side over here in order to set down the second path. I'll click once, twice, and then a third time, and then to end the path, I need to click again on that endpoint. If I want to change the blur shape, I'll just click on the small dot, the red one here, and make that change. All right, once I've got the blurred path that I want, I'll click OK. That'll apply it to layer 0. And now, in order to remove these edges here, I'll select layer 1, click on the layer mask icon at the bottom of the layers panel, select my paintbrush, get a little bit smaller of a brush, make sure that I'm painting with black, and then I can just paint around the edge of the clock in order to hide that extra portion that we had, that original selection. And when I hide that, we can see the blurred path image underneath it. Again, I'll just paint right around here in order to hide that, making this blurry down around the base of the clock, making sure that there's no extra information there. If I accidentally paint too far, I can tap the X key. That will exchange my foreground and my background color, and just paint that area in. Again, painting with black to remove, and painting with white in order to reveal. And there you are, an easy way to change the shape of an object in Photoshop using Liquify and add some motion using the Path Blur filter.